I was sitting in a workshop at a pastor's conference, and the speaker, he told this story, and I'm not exactly sure what it had to do with the subject of the workshop. I can't remember the point, but he told this story. And see, this speaker had been a pastor, or was a pastor, and he had earlier in his life had a mentor. And he actually even lived in the home of his mentor for a while. His mentor was also a pastor, but an older pastor. And he told this story about when he had stayed with them, and later on he had a conversation with his people. So after he had moved out, and then years later he came back, and he was having a conversation with this mentor and his wife. And he told them the thing that he remembered was how his mentor flirted with his wife. And when he told them that years later, she leaned over and whispered to him, "He still does that." You see, it's interesting because one of the greatest things that he learned from his mentor was about marriage. Now, I'll tell you about another guy. There was a professional basketball player. He was single, and he was a Christian. And this man was very careful to maintain sexual purity. The thing is that many others in his circles of influence, the other players, other people, they knew about this, and they knew how intentional he was to be pure. And some of them mocked him about it. They made fun of him. They teased him. And some of them even tried to trip him up. In fact, there were several times, more than once, where he got back to his motel room after when they're on the road after playing the game, and found a woman in his motel room that had been planted by someone else trying to trip him up. Well, what did he do? He started not going back to his motel room alone. But he was very careful not to give in to that temptation to sexual sin. He stood firm. He maintained his testimony because he was living for Christ. Now, there are many things, and we can talk about things like this in relationships or whatever, many things that we may tend to think of as simply personal issues. But they may actually be spiritual issues as well. Being single or being married is not an issue of spiritual maturity. But how you live as a single person or how you live as a married person is an issue of spiritual maturity. We are to live for the Lord. But how do we do that? How do we live for the Lord as a single person? How do we live for the Lord as a married person? These are the kind of questions that the Corinthians were asking. And Paul discusses marriage. In the passage that we're going to look at today, Paul discusses marriage, he discusses singleness, he discusses divorce, but this is not a complete instructional guide on the subject of those things. He is actually rather addressing some specific issues that they had asked about or written about. Look in chapter 7, verse 1. The beginning of verse 1, he says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote." So he says, now concerning. We're going to see this word over and over again throughout the rest of the book. Now concerning. And when he says this, we're reminded they had written a letter to Paul. And in that letter, they had asked him some questions or maybe stated their own opinions about some things. And so he is writing in response to those things. And so he says, now concerning the things that you have written. But this is an interesting chapter as we come here to chapter 7 because it contains some commands and concessions. It contains principles and opinions. It contains rules and freedom. And so as we look through this passage, we see a good example of working through issues and coming to conclusions by applying wisdom and biblical principles. The issue in this chapter appears to stem from an idea that apparently some of the Corinthians had, that all sexual activity should be avoided. Now, that means, apparently, some people in the Corinthian church were okay with sexual immorality, like we talked about last week, and Paul had to correct them on that, even going to prostitutes. And others in the church said, all sexual activity is wrong. We did talk about them having divisions, right? And disagreements. Well, anyway, so we have some people who are on opposite ends of the fence here. But these who believed that all sexual activity was to be avoided, they would even go as far as say, even within marriage, it should be avoided. And they somehow saw that this was somehow more spiritual than the opposite. And so this idea also led to the idea that maybe you shouldn't even get married in the first place. And if you were married, then maybe you should end that marriage through divorce in order to avoid the temptation. And so this is what we're looking at here in this chapter. And so it begins then in verses, with talking about the marriage relationship in verses 1 through 6. He says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. And so we begin here, he starts by stating the Corinthians' position, that it's not good to have any sexual relationships. Literally, it's not good for a man to touch a woman. That's a euphemism for sexual relations, having sexual relationships. But he quickly refutes that statement in verse 2 where he says, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Now, many read this statement here where he says this, and they think that Paul has a very low view of marriage, as if he's saying marriage is simply a way to stop sexual sin. Well, if you don't commit adultery or commit immorality, you should just be married. And I don't think that's a proper way of looking at Paul's view of marriage. Paul actually has a much higher view of marriage. And if we read all his writings, we can see this in his writings. He will say how marriage is a God-given gift and how it's a picture of the relationship between Christ and the church. And so Paul actually has a high view of marriage. But here what we have in this passage is Paul had just talked about how bad sexual immorality is in the previous passage. And now he's talking about it again. And he says that there is this temptation to fulfill desires, sexual desires outside of the marriage. And it can be a huge problem. And so now he comes and he says, so every man should have his own wife, and every woman should have her own husband. Now, when he says that, he's not saying you should get married. What he's saying is this word have is another euphemism for the sexual relationship. So he's saying that a husband and a wife should have their own wife, should have sexual relationships with their husband or wife, with their spouse. So basically what he's coming down, he's saying that married people should have sex with their spouse. And sexual desires should be fulfilled within that marriage relationship. And if they are not, then you are opening the door to temptation. The thing is, if you think about this, does just being married, simply being married, stop everyone from sexual sin? No. People will still sin sexually even if they're married. So this is not the answer to sexual immorality. Get married. He's simply saying that if you are married, that you should not refrain or abstain, because abstaining can open you to temptation. Well, he continues the argument here against abstaining, and he says that each spouse in the marriage has the right to sex, so neither is to refuse it or withhold it from the other. Now, I want you to notice here that the woman and the man have the same right in this marriage, in this relationship. They have the same rights. And then Paul takes the argument even further, and he says that the husband and the wife actually belong to each other. Now, this reminds me of the statement from Song of Solomon, where he says, "I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine." Now, this is not just a romantic notion. Oh, we belong to each other. It's not just romance here. He's actually making a point. You actually belong to each other. When two people get married, you are giving yourself to the other one. They are giving themselves to each other. Paul goes so far as to say that the individual's body is under the control, the authority of their spouse. Now, some maybe listen to this and say, wait a minute. Because some people do actually react to this way of thinking and suggest that it opens the door to abusive behavior, to unkind behavior. And I'm sure this verse has been used to support that kind of abusive behavior by some people. But this verse does not demand that we have to demand our way, or that we have to push ourselves on our spouse, or force our spouse to do certain things. What we need to do is we need to read this verse and have this idea of mutual ownership within the marriage relationship and place it right alongside the other biblical teachings of love, of not being selfish and not being self-seeking and being kind. And we can list off many other biblical ideas. But Paul is saying, don't deny the sexual relationship within that marriage. It's an important part of marriage, and you should be taking full advantage of it. And he makes his point very clear with the statement, do not deprive one another. In other words, married couples should not abstain from sex. Now, he makes one concession. And in verse 6, he says, I say this as a matter of concession, not as the command. So there is a command and there's a concession. But the concession here, we find that where he starts. He says, do not deprive one another, except, maybe for a short time, to pray. So that is the concession. The command is, don't deprive one another. The concession is, except maybe a short time, to pray. Now, he doesn't explain what that means or what that would look like, what that short time is. And it may be kind of like a fast. You know, when you fast from eating, in order to take time to focus on God and to spend purposeful time in prayer. And so that's what he says. But he just says, except for maybe a short time for prayer. But he says it must be by mutual agreement, so you both agree to it, and it's a short time. But then you resume that relationship so that you don't open door to temptation. Why? Because people are weak. Because we are weak. And if you wait too long, if you stop and abstain for too long, then you're opening yourself up to temptation and you may fall prey to Satan. Well, from here he moves on to a situation in which to abstain from sexual activity is actually good. And he briefly discusses the idea of celibacy. Look at verse 7 through 9. He says, I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So Paul here, after saying all those things that he had said about not abstaining from sex, he wants to be careful not to disregard the idea of remaining single as a good option. In fact, Paul himself is single and therefore celibate. And he says it's a good thing. And so he's encouraging people here to remain single. And he says that remaining single, even after being widowed, is just as good as being married. But it's not for everyone. He says that each has his own gift from God. And when he says this, what he's saying is that some people have the gift of marriage, and some people God has given the gift of celibacy, singleness. And he looks at them both as a gift. He says each has his own gift from God. But here's the thing. If you have strong sexual desires, that's a clue to you that you do not have the gift of celibacy. You have not been given the gift of singleness. And it would be better to marry. So again, Paul is not saying that marriage is the cure for all sexual desire. There's an old song that came out in the 90s, a Christian song, it was in the 90s, and it said, if you can't control your lust, get married. Rather crass, but also kind of misses the point. It's not exactly to the point here. What Paul is saying is that if you have those strong desires, then God has not given you the gift of celibacy, so it's better to marry. Well, then he moves on, and it appears that some had taken this wrong idea of married couples abstaining from sex so far as to think it would be better to divorce and not be married at all. And so now Paul deals with the subject of divorce. Verses 10 and 11. He says, to the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. So here he's speaking to two believers who are married, and he gives them a command. But you notice he says, not I, but the Lord. And by saying that, what he's saying is that Jesus is the one who actually said this, and I am just repeating what Jesus said. So he's telling you he's repeating Jesus' command. And so he tells them this. And what did Jesus say? Well, Jesus said that the two become one, and that what God has joined together, let no man take apart. Now, in teaching, Jesus also gave the concession of adultery, like in the case of adultery, that there was freedom there. But the command was don't divorce. Now, Paul comes along and he says the same thing. If you have two believers who are married, they are not free to divorce at will. But then he also says, but if they were to divorce, then they should remain unmarried, which leaves open the possibility of reconciliation. Because reconciliation is the Christian ideal. Not just in marriage, but in all things, we look to reconcile. It's a very biblical Christian idea. Now, many arguments have been made about the various grounds on which divorce is allowed. Jesus gave the case of adultery. But what we see in the Bible is that divorce is never ideal. Marriage is meant to be permanent, and Christians are called to reconcile. Now, we could have a much larger discussion on the topic of divorce this morning. We're not going to because I don't have the time to, but also it's not the main point of this passage. And so I'm just going to say this. Basically, the basic command is do not divorce. Therefore, this command must be given much weight when considering these things. Continue reading in verses 12 to 16. To the rest, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So he bends here. Now he's talking about to other people. He says to the rest. And so when he's talking to the rest, what he means is he's talking to Christians who are married to a non-believer. Now, how would that happen? How would a Christian be not married to a non-believer? Well, if you remember in Corinth, the gospel had not been to Corinth until Paul took it to Corinth. And he went to Corinth and he shared the gospel with people, and many people believed. Now, within that group of believers, there would be some people who were married people where one believed and one did not. And so you may find yourself in a position there where you, as a believer, was married to a non-believer, and now you have this problem, and you may then start wondering if it was wrong to remain married to a non-believer. Would that be an act of disobedience? Would that cause you to be out of fellowship with God? But Paul gives some direction here to them. And when he says this, he gives this command. He says, I, not the Lord. I mean, by this, what he's saying is this is not part of the command that Jesus gave. In other words, Jesus did not speak directly to this issue. And so Paul then is giving his own command. He's applying the command of Jesus to this new situation. And basically what Paul says is if the non-believing spouse is willing to remain in that marriage relationship, then you should. And he says that we are called to peace. So we're not called to come and to make problems to break up those relationships. But we should look for peace in that relationship. He goes on to also say, though, that the believer has a positive effect on the family. Rather than making the believer disobedient by remaining in that relationship, the believer is actually a conduit of God's blessing to the entire family. Now, by saying this, he says that they are made holy. By saying this, he's not saying that they are saved even if they have not believed in Jesus. But because of the believer being in that family is somehow set apart to God. Holy, set apart. Somehow set apart to God. Set apart to experience God's grace. And it may be just as simple as the fact that the family will be familiar with the gospel. Which ties directly into his next statement that he says, his additional reason why they should remain is that the life of the believer is a testimony to the non-believing spouse, and therefore the non-believing spouse may come to believe in Jesus through their testimony. So he says, stay there. But the other side of his command is that if the non-believer is not willing to stay, to remain in that relationship, then the believing spouse is free. Meaning it's not wrong if the non-believer leaves you. It's not wrong if you are divorced by that non-believer. But what we see here is that the command to remain married forever and not to divorce still stands for the Christian. But it cannot be enforced on the non-believer who does not live by the ways of God, by the commands of God. Well, now in this passage, Paul explains a principle for life. And it's a principle that he's been applying to much of this discussion. And we see it starts in verse 17. He says, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. He says, this is the basic principle that I teach everywhere I go. This is the principle that I live by. And basically the principle is to live the life that God has given you. Live the life that God has called you to. Whatever situation you were in when you were saved, he says, stay there. Now, we understand that this doesn't refer to sinful situations, but it applies to non-moral situations. And then he gives us some specific examples. The first one is in verse 18 and 19. He says, was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at that time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. So we hear he's saying basically don't try to become circumcised or to reverse your circumcision. And he may be saying here don't try to become a Jew or to no longer be a Jew. But he's just simply just stay where you are and just live for God. He says the circumcision means nothing, so you don't need to change it. His point here is that God accepts you as you are. And so you don't have to improve your standing before God. In fact, you can't improve your standing before God. You are already a child of God. He has accepted you when you came to faith in Jesus. However, he says, but keep the commandments of God. In other words, obey Him. Change any immoral way of living that might be part of your life and get in line with the ways of God. The second example he gives in verses 20 through 24. He says, each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. So he says, if you were a slave, when you came to believe in Jesus, if you were a slave, he says, don't worry about it. In other words, that's not the focus of your life. Don't worry about it. He says, at the same time, if you were free when you came to believe in Jesus, he says it doesn't really matter because he gives this example. What he's saying is when he said, let me back up here. Back up to the slave. He says, if you were a slave, don't worry about it. But then he gives a little concession. But he says, if you have the opportunity to free yourself or to be free, then take it. That's a good thing. It's good. So go ahead and do it. On the other hand, in other words, what he's saying is, if you can better your situation, go ahead. But if not, don't stress out about it. Don't let that become the focus of your life and worry so much about it that that's all you're thinking about. Because what really matters? What really matters is your relationship with Jesus. And he gives this example. He says, you may be a slave in this world. But he says, but in Jesus, you're free. And on the other hand, he says, we all belong to Jesus. So even if you're a free person in this world, what's he say? We're all slaves of Christ. And really that's what life is about. It's about obeying Him and living for Him. And he says, so that's not the focus, your situation in life. He says, if you can improve it, great. If not, that's not your focus. Don't worry about it. Don't stress about it. So whatever position you may have been in when you were saved, here's the key. Now you're doing it for God. So whatever you were doing, now you're doing it for God. So you're doing it as a servant of Jesus. You're doing it for God's glory. So whatever your position in life, it's now been elevated. Because your position has been set apart to God. And Paul says, stay there. Stay where you're at, but do it for God. Now there's one last situation he discusses here. And that's, should people get married in the first place? What about those who are not yet married or those who have been widowed? Look at verses 25 to 28. He says, now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgments as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have troubles, and I would spare you that. The word betrothed here is literally virgin. So here he's talking about a single person who has never been married. And so he says, the question is, should they get married or should they just stay single? Now, Jesus didn't speak directly to this issue, so Paul is giving his own advice. Now, his own advice is no less authoritative or no less trustworthy. He is an apostle who was sent by Jesus, and he is an inspired writer of Scripture. So it doesn't mean, this is a lesser bit of advice because it didn't come from Jesus, but he's just making it clear that he is giving his own advice, that Jesus did not speak directly to this issue. But he uses the same principle that he had just described, to remain as you were. And that's his advice. If you're married, then stay married. If you're single, then stay single. But he says, but if you get married, it's okay. It's not a sin. It's not wrong. But he thinks being single is better. Why? Because it's what he thinks is best. Basically because he thinks it's easier. It's easier to live for Christ, and it's easier to live as a Christian in this world if you're single. And he gives 3 supporting points. The first one is he saw a time of distress coming for believers. And his thought is that would be harder to handle if you were married. So let me explain. Let me give you an example to help you understand this. It would be very difficult to stand firm in your faith and be martyred for your faith. It would be even more difficult to stand firm and be martyred for your faith if you know that when you die, you're leaving behind a spouse or kids with no one to care for them. So in a way, he's saying, hey, it's easier if you're single. The second reason he gives, or the point he gives to support this idea or his thinking, is that when you're married, it increases your cares and your responsibilities, and it takes a lot of energy. And it focuses you more on matters of this life than on Christ. And look, he explains this more in verses 29 to 31. He says, this is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as those who were not mourning, and those who rejoice as those who were not rejoicing, and those who buy as those who had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. His thinking here is that if Jesus is coming soon, shouldn't we live like it? If Jesus is coming soon, then shouldn't our lives reflect that? Shouldn't we live like we're expecting him to come soon? Now, he's not suggesting here that we neglect our responsibilities, or that we never mourn, or that we never rejoice, and I can prove that biblically, because what's he say? Rejoice, and again I say, rejoice. So he's not saying we should never rejoice. We should never do these things. He's not saying you should never buy the things that you need. He's not saying you should never do your work or have dealings with people in the world. But he is saying that our time on earth is temporary. It won't last forever. And so the things of this world should not be our main focus in life. He continues with this third point. We see that in verses 32 through 35. He says, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried man or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. He's saying, Why would it be better to be single or easier? Because the single person can focus on the things of God. The single person can more easily focus on serving Jesus and can focus on how to live for Him. The married person's focus is divided. Because not only does the married person have to live for Jesus, they also have to live for their spouse. Not only do we live to please Jesus, but we also try to please our spouse. But he goes on to say, but you know what? It's not wrong. None of this is wrong. It's actually a good thing, but it takes away from the time and the energy that you can put into serving Christ. But the single person can put all of his time and energy, all of his strength into living for God. So he says, I'm not making up rules to stop you from enjoying marriage. And he wants to make that clear. It's okay if you choose to marry. But Paul believes that it's truly better to stay single because you can give your undivided devotion to the Lord. Now in verses 36 to 38, I can't take the time to read them, but in verses 36 to 38, again, he says that it's okay to marry or to stay single. Both are good, but being single is better. And then in verses 39 to 40, he says that the same is true for the widowed person. That the widowed person, once they are widowed, they are now free to marry. But he thinks it's better to stay single for the same reasons. We've talked about a lot of things this morning and a lot of different areas of life, but we can draw some important principles. And the main overarching principle in all of it is live for the Lord. Live for the Lord. If you are married, be faithful to God. How? By being faithful to your spouse and not yielding to sexual temptations. If you are married, be faithful to God. How? By being faithful to your spouse and not seeking divorce. If you are single, be faithful to God. How? By obeying Him and staying pure, recognizing that you have a unique opportunity right now to serve God. You have fewer obligations. You have fewer distractions. You are not as tied down. You have more time. You have more freedom. You have more energy to use in serving God. And if you are single or married, make God the focus of your life. Seek to please Him first and foremost. And lastly, life is not about climbing the ladder. Life is not all about improving our situation. The problem is many of us live that way, like it is. We're all about getting higher up, improving our situation, having the next best thing or a better place. Now, if you have the opportunity to improve your situation, there's nothing wrong with that, and it may be a good thing. But improving your situation should not consume you. It shouldn't consume you like it does so many people. As followers of Jesus, we should be consumed with Jesus. We should be consumed with following Him, with being more like Him, with bringing people to Him. We should be consumed with Jesus. We should be giving our devotion to Him and living for Him. So are you married? Are you single? The most important thing is that you live for the Lord.